Hey, welcome to Wait, That Really Happened, a podcast covering true crime, history, and conspiracy. The bevy for the epi is apple cider because fall is near, fall is nigh, and I'm very excited. I am so sorry I could not get an episode out last week. I was sick and I was also very behind on homework assignments, so I took the week to do that, but also this case is so mind-boggling to me that I wanted to make sure that I got all of the information that I wanted to relay to you all. The topic of this episode is truly a wait that really happened, and I came across it because I find early American cases to be really fascinating. 19th century, 20th century is such an interesting time in American history and our development, and just in the world in general. A lot of things were going on, so I am very excited about this case that we're going to be talking about because it's so crazy. It's just so crazy. I will say this episode discusses sexual assault a lot, other forms of violence, as well as murder. So if you don't want to listen to that, I would suggest not listening to this episode. With all that said, we are going to be looking at the case of Jolly Jane. Jane Toppin was born as Honora Kelly in Boston on March 31st of either 1854 or 1857. There are conflicting records, but given that 1857 is reported from the Boston Female Asylum and other census records, we will assume that it was probably 1857. She supposedly had 3 or 4 sisters, but she was one of the 2 youngest. Her parents, Bridget and Peter Kelly, were Irish immigrants, and her mother died of tuberculosis when Nora was very young. Her father, Peter, was known as an alcoholic and became locally known as Kelly the Crack. Crack as in crackpot, not, the other thing. Throughout the years, rumors of Peter being insane would spread through the area. This rumor was never confirmed by any mental health diagnosis, but it is said that his rumored insanity drew him to sew his eyelids shut at one point. In 1863, he either determined he couldn't properly take care of them or simply just didn't want to take care of his children anymore, so he brought 8-year-old Delia Josephine and 6-year-old Nora to the Boston Female Asylum for Orphans, and they would never see their father again. There are no records of the girls' time there, really, but the orphanage did go through a series of changes while still being mostly respected as a facility, so I don't think it was as bad as some other places, but we obviously won't ever really know. There isn't much record of her sisters either, but Delia did have an extremely hard life. She tried to earn enough to survive through sex work, but often fell back on her alcoholism and eventually passed away in poverty. She had a very tough life. Her other sister, Nellie, was committed to an insane asylum in her early 20s. It was the mission of the orphanage to receive, protect, and instruct female orphans until the age of 10 years, when they are to be placed in respectable families. Just 2 years after being dropped off by her father, Jane was placed as an indentured servant in November of 1864 with the family of Mrs. Anne C. Toppin of Lowell, Massachusetts. When she was signed over to Anne Toppin's custody, it wasn't actually an official adoption, which is kind of what they marketed it as. There are no existing records to show that she was legally adopted to be a daughter to Anne. She was just signed in a contract to become an indentured servant. So Anne Toppin wasn't looking for another daughter to have. She was looking for someone to be a servant to the household. She began attending school and was noted to be incredibly bright. Elizabeth Toppin was Anne's daughter and technically Jane's adoptive sister, but Anne rarely acted equal towards them, and she would often make sure that Jane was aware and shameful of her Irish heritage, which was a thing that people still cared about in the late and early 1900s. And she would let Elizabeth go play with her friends, but Jane was always home working and doing chores around the house. As Jane did begin going to school around this time, she was known to be very intelligent and picked up things very quickly, but she was also known to spread gossip. There is a psychologist, Henry R. Stedman, who did some studies on Jane Toppan, and he said, quote, "She told many tales which we knew to be sheer inventions, among them a story of her parentage. Her alleged father having in reality lived in China for 2 years before her birth, another of her horror of the dead, which was so great that she sometimes fell senseless at the sight of dead bodies. Until Jane was a woman, she was under good moral and religious influences, home surroundings, and discipline, and had good associates, but her incorrigible propensities for deceit, falsehood, and troublemaking never absent from the first." There's a story that Jane had a lover, and they promised to get married once Jane had turned 16. He gave her a ring in the shape of a bird as like an engagement ring or a promise ring. Later, it is said that he moved out west and fell in love with his landlady's daughter, so he wrote Jane a letter apologizing and breaking off the engagement. This is said to have sent Jane into her spiral of darkness. I personally think her extremely traumatic past and constant interaction with people who belittled her, told her she was less than, told her to be ashamed of her ancestry was probably more the cause of the spiral, but this story is around in different articles that I read. On Jane's 18th birthday, and upon graduating from Lowell High School, Anne Toppan technically released her out of the indentured servitude contract, and per that contract, she gave Jane $50. But Jane actually stayed in the Toppan house working for 7 more years before Anne's attitude towards Jane was just too much and she couldn't stay. After she had finally left the Toppan household, she began studying to become a nurse at Cambridge Hospital. She was actually very good at her job and described to be well-liked, bright, and friendly. And I think to kind of compensate for maybe all the insecurities that had developed from, her entire life worth of trauma, she earned the nickname Jolly Jane. So from this point, this is when the case starts to become disturbing. There will be talk of sexual fetishes, poisoning, and death. So again, if that is not something you want to listen to, please feel free to stop listening here. Beginning at Cambridge Hospital, Jane would become closer to her parents, especially elderly and very sick patients. She would use them as guinea pigs to experiment with giving morphine and atropine. Now, morphine, I'm sure you've heard of. It is a pain medication that is used to treat severe pain and chronic pain. It is an opioid, and side effects of taking too much include extreme drowsiness, seizures, fainting, and hallucinations. Atropine is used pre-surgery to remove saliva and other fluids from the respiratory tract, as well as treating other conditions. It's also a nerve agent, which means it prevents the nervous system from working properly, and medically is used to help slow nerve-damaging diseases, and can sometimes be used to treat poisonings from nightshade, jimson weed, and mandrake. Side effects of receiving larger than advised doses include dizziness, nausea, extreme confusion, hallucinations, and loss of balance and vision. A final drug that will be mentioned later is strychnine. Today, strychnine is used as a pesticide to kill rats. In the past, it was used in incredibly small doses as medication for humans. I'm going to read a quote from the CDC about how it works. Strychnine prevents the proper operation of the chemical that controls nerve signals to the muscles. The chemical controlling nerve signals works like the body's off switch for muscles. When this off switch does not work correctly, muscles throughout the body have severe, painful spasms. Even though the person's consciousness or thinking are not affected at first, except that the person is very excitable and in pain, eventually the muscles tire and the person can't breathe, which means they start suffocating. Side effects include agitation, fear, painful muscle spasms leading to fever and organ injury, rigid arms and legs, uncontrollable arching of the neck and back, jaw tightness, muscle pain and soreness, difficulty breathing, and I think probably the worst, is initial consciousness and awareness of symptoms. It's an absolutely horrific drug. I did look all of that up on the internet. I'm not claiming to know anything about medicine. Clearly, none of these drugs should be used in excess, and Jane was basically just faking the charts and doing experiments on her elderly patients to see what would happen. There is no way to truly know what the patients experienced with Jane while she was doing this to them, though it is reported that she would get into bed with them and comfort them while they were essentially incapacitated from these overdoses. She said in court that she felt a sexual thrill by bringing patients to the brink of death and back again. One victim, named Amelia Finney, actually survived one of these encounters with Jane. She was disoriented and felt herself dying as Jane got into bed with her and started caressing her, kissing her, holding her close, but remembers Jane suddenly getting out of bed, interrupted by another nurse being near the room. She would wake up the next morning assuming it was all a dream, but in later years she would realize that she had actually survived attempted murder. While she was a nurse at the hospital, there was a report of many hospital supplies being stolen or going missing, including money, stationery, aprons, and uniforms. After various falsified medical charts and misuse of medications, she was discharged from Cambridge Hospital before graduating the nursing training program. Her coworkers didn't really like her there. Obviously, they could tell some things were just not right with her, and she had that charming, know-it-all personality. They also didn't know that she was actually poisoning patients. They just knew she typically gave too much morphine and atropine. She was also oddly obsessed with autopsies, which made other doctors and her coworkers uneasy. Despite this, she got a glowing recommendation letter from some of the doctors at Cambridge and went on to join the training program at Massachusetts General Hospital in 1888. At the Cambridge Hospital, it is believed she killed over a dozen patients. At Massachusetts General, Jane was given a temporary head nurse position while the permanent head nurse was on leave, and most of, if not all of her colleagues disliked her for her blatant disregard for prescription amounts and her odd obsession with morphine and atropine. Some people thought she herself was abusing these drugs because she was so obsessed with them and their side effects. She killed several more people at Mass General and was discharged on a technicality because she was caught outside of her ward without permission. She never actually received her nursing license, but did complete and receive a signed nursing degree. After she left Mass General, she went back to Cambridge but didn't last there very long because she, again, was assumed to be over-administering opioids, which she was. So that ended her career in the public area of nursing in hospitals, but she was just getting started on her killing sprees. After her time at Cambridge Hospital and Mass General, Jane began her career as a private nurse. She became active in 1891, and her clients became wary of her as she continued to steal items from their households, failed to return borrowed money, and constantly lied. She was, however, widely considered to be the most popular private nurse in Cambridge, applauded for her deep care of patients. Despite the calls of petty theft and questionable behavior of Jane, the years of 1891 to 1895 were filled with success for her. She, at one point, was making $25, while the normal working woman was making only $5. 1895 was a turning point for Jane, and when she lost kind of all self-control. While living with her landlord, Israel Dunham, she killed him because he had become, quote, old and cranky. She moved in with his wife, Levy Dunham, who was killed in 1897. It is believed she did this to get out of debt from her rent or simply because she could. There are conflicting reports on who traveled to who for this next part. So one story is that Elizabeth Brigham, her foster sister, who was previously Elizabeth Toppin, had a vacation home in Cape Cod, and Jane would sometimes visit. The other story is that Jane was just vacationing in Buzzard Bay, which is an area of Cape Cod, and Elizabeth came to visit her, complaining of her depression. Either way, in 1899, Jane ended up in Cape Cod. It was here she poisoned her sister with strychnine, claiming later that this would be the first victim she killed because she hated her, not just for the thrill. In this year, she also killed an acquaintance, Mary McClear, which was very much unlike her, as she often targeted people she knew very well. Jane had been recommended to her as a woman nurse, and not much else is known, but it's suspected Jane stole some of Mary's clothes. In February of 1900, Jane killed a close friend because she wanted her job as a dining matron at the theological school. She lied to the dean, saying that her friend, Myra Connors, was out on leave and that she was the replacement. From the jump, Jane did a terrible job at managing her duties in this position, and her coworkers noticed quickly and didn't really like her. So in that same year, she was fired because of lost money and other complaints. She didn't have any victims from the theological school besides Myra that we know of. The next part gets a little bit confusing, so stay with me. Jane moved into a new house with new landlords, Melvin and Eliza Beadle, and the housekeeper Mary Sullivan. She didn't kill any of these people, but she did poison them enough that they felt some of the physical effects. Mary Sullivan was poisoned enough to seem drunk and was dismissed from her housekeeping job because of this, which allowed Jane to step in to the position. This is really the catalyst to murder for Jane. If she was off the rails before, she was just crashing the train over and over again at this point. In 1901, a woman named Mary Davis was traveling to Jane to collect a $500 rent that Jane owed for her vacation housing in Cotamet. While she was traveling to Cambridge, she fell down a set of stairs and was left in Jane's care. After 7 days of slowly being poisoned, Mary collapsed and died. Her death was drawn out, and Jane basically experimented and played with Mary as she was dying, bringing her in and out of consciousness, sending her into deep comas. She did this by giving her morphine in a type of mineral water that hid the taste of the drug. After she had passed, Jane took her body with her as she traveled back to Cotamet to the rest of Mary's family. I never found out exactly what she did with the body when she got there, though maybe it was so she could give it to them for a funeral or something, I'm not really sure. She essentially moved into that household and tried to become part of the family, maybe even replace Mary. 3 times, Jane lit the house on fire, once in the pantry, once in a closet, and once in an unidentified location. None of them were very damaging, and no one was hurt. Soon after these occurrences, Jane poisoned Genevieve Gordon, who was the youngest daughter of Alden and Mary Davis, and brushed it off as suicide due to grief of her mother's death. In just 2 weeks after that, she killed Alden Davis, Genevieve's father. Lastly, she poisoned and killed Minnie Gibbs, the eldest daughter, just 5 days after killing her father. After this, she returned to Lawwell. Lawwell is where her foster sister had lived with her husband Oramel, just to try and keep things clear. Jane wanted to marry Oramel, so she did everything she could to try and convince him to do so. She poisoned him and nursed him back to health to convince him that he needed her. When that didn't work, she poisoned herself, which landed her in the hospital, and then she actually tried again to kill herself by poisoning, which ended her in the hospital again. She also killed Oramel's sister, Edna Bannister, because she felt that Edna would get in the way of her and Oramel getting married. When she was discharged that second time from the hospital, Oramel kicked her out of his house because, she was absolutely unhinged. So now we need to backtrack a little bit because things really start to unravel for Jane once she is through murdering the Davis family. If you remember Minnie, the eldest daughter, her father-in-law was Captain Gibbs. Captain Gibbs saw the tragedy of the Davis family in the newspaper and knew something was immediately wrong because his daughter-in-law had been in prime health when she had died. A doctor named Ira Cushing was on vacation and had even seen Alden the day before he died. So they both suspected foul play in regards to the unfortunate Davis family event. Captain Gibbs had a handy old family friend who was Leonard Wood, the U.S. military governor of Cuba. Leonard had studied medicine and initially went into the military as a surgeon, but quickly moved into the position of officer. He was the commanding officer of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, despite Teddy getting the credit. He happened to be vacationing in Cape Cod in 1901 when all this was going down. Given his ranking and medical experience, he was able to launch an investigation into the Davis family murders. The bodies of the Davis family were exhumed and tested for poisons, which were, of course, identified. Given the captain's suspicions and other reports of her tendencies to steal and lie, the police had their eye on Jane, especially after she was discharged from the hospital a second time. On October 29, 1901, while visiting friends in Amherst, New Hampshire, Jane was arrested. She was given an attorney by the name of F.M. Bixby. Jane didn't like that and requested instead to be represented by her childhood friend, James Stewart Murphy. James apparently liked Jane very much, and it is suspected that he may have had a crush on her. Jane was in prison for 7 months while awaiting her trial. She was indicted for 3 counts of murder of the Davis family, but she was only being tried for the murder of Mrs. Gibbs. This story was huge. It was a worldwide sensation. Everyone knew about it. It was in all of the papers because this was the first time that a woman had killed for pleasure, not just to do it. Jane was actually studied by psychologists, as I mentioned earlier, and deemed insane by Henry Stedman, George Jelly, and Hosea Quinby. Though it is widely believed she actually wasn't insane, she had just grown up in a household filled with a lot of mental health disorders, so it's kind of a nature versus nurture argument. She went along with the diagnosis, though, believing it would help her with her case. Her trial was 8 hours long, and after, the jury debated for only 27 minutes before coming back with a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. She was sentenced to live out the remainder of her life at the Taunton Insane Asylum. She was known to be quite quiet there, though older attendants at the asylum remembered Jane smiling at them and saying, "Get some morphine, dearie, and we'll go out into the ward. You and I will have a fun time seeing them die." Jane died on August 22, 1938, and is buried in the Mayflower Hill Cemetery in Taunton. It is confirmed that she murdered 31 people, but it is accepted that the actual number is probably around 100 people. At the end of the trial in 1902, during her confession, she said, "If I had been a married woman, I probably would not have killed all those people. I would have had my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind." She also infamously said that she aspired to, quote, "have killed more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who ever lived." So that is the crazy story of Jolly Jane Toppan. I was honestly mind blown reading this. There's just so much cruelty and selfishness, and I just couldn't really wrap my head around it, honestly. And it's just really scary to realize what people can become when they grow up in a hostile environment, an unhealthy environment, and are just constantly surrounded by people who don't care about them. I feel I can't even fathom what the one woman who survived felt either. Like that's terrifying to realize years later that you were almost murdered by this woman who was taking care of you. So I'm really glad I did that case to learn about it, and I think it is a testament to nature versus nurture and just being kind to people, because gosh, a lot can go wrong when you're not. To finish out, I do have an Am I the Asshole post. It is a little heartbreaking, I'm not going to lie, and it was posted by Infinite List 850. Am I the asshole for walking out of my fiance's parents' house when they invited my family to dinner? I, 21 male, don't speak to my family, which is my parents, mom and dad, and older brother, by almost 8 years. My fiance's family knows this, but they had mentioned how great it would be for them to meet. They told me it was probably going to do good for them to see me doing well, and I had told them they did not want me to do good in life. My fiance spoke to her parents and explained things better than me, which we thought had put an end to this fantasy. But last weekend, when we showed up to their house for dinner, we realized we were wrong, because 10 minutes after we got there, my parents showed up. Questions were asked about my brother, who was also invited, and my parents bluntly said he didn't want to come. I didn't wait around for more, and I left, my wife following me after saying something to them, which turned out to be a very firm warning to not reach out. They had a miserable time. My parents showed their true colors. My fiance's parents believe me, but are pissed I left. They said I shouldn't have stormed out like I did. For those who need context on my family, when my brother was 5, he was diagnosed with a kidney problem, something that could cause cancer in time, but a cancer diagnosis soon followed. He needed a new kidney, and he needed bone marrow and stem cells. My parents ended up talking to a doctor who told them they could have a perfect match child through IVF. They proceeded with this, which is how I came into the world. Only the doctor was a fraud, and I wasn't a match even in blood type. My parents were distraught. They hated me for being born wrong, for not turning out like they had planned. But my brother got what he needed through other donors. Even though he went into remission and got his condition under control, they never forgave me. My brother never cared about me either. He said I had been a waste of their money. I was treated like some random child dropped on the doorstep. Worse even, no gifts, no support, no love, no affection, you name it. They told me I deserved to have a shitty life for what I had done. When I was 16, they sent me away to be a part of a program that got me out of their hair and allowed me to focus on getting a good job because they were never going to help me with college, even signing papers. It cost them nothing and meant I moved, so they agreed. We had no contact since. So absolutely not. You are not the asshole. Your fiance's parents did not have the right to contact your family like that, especially after you had explicitly told them not to. And I am so deeply sorry that that was your childhood growing up. That isn't something anyone should have to deal with. And I think there's a movie about like this scenario where they parents have another kid to help with their older kids' medical issues. I don't know what it's called, but that is not a child being created with love and the intention of being cared for. That is a child being created to be used. And we can't control everything as humans. And, doctors aren't always right. So blaming that on you does not make it. There is no logic to blaming you for that because you had no control over your DNA. You had no control over the fact that you were created and born into this world, into this family. So no, you are not the asshole. I am so sorry that happened to you. People need to learn boundaries. That is all I have for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard and you want to hear more, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or leave 5 stars on Spotify to help boost the pod to other people who might be interested in these topics. If you want to request cases or historical moments to be covered on the pod, go ahead and email me at wtrhappened@gmail.com. And if you want podcast updates or pictures from each episode, you can follow me on Instagram at thesocialbutterflywtrh. Thank you so much for listening and have a great rest of your day.